So I want to switch gears for a little bit here. One of the most popular topics on the national interest these days is the subject of all things China. And there's been a lot of articles, commentary, sort of looking at the dynamics of possible Russian and Chinese collaborations, whether they're talking about military technologies, economic collaborations. There's recently a $400 billion economic package of gas and natural resources that's been signed. So my question to you, Nick, is if things in Ukraine were to spiral even more out of control, if the U.S.-Russia relationship were to really suffer any more, how far do you see sort of Moscow and Beijing sort of joining hands? Is there even possibility of some sort of formal alliance?
Formal alliance, probably not, because the Chinese are very cautious. The Chinese don't like to extend guarantees that they may then have to live up to. So they're certainly not going to want to have a formal defensive alliance with the Russians. But apart from that, there's still a wide area of cooperation. And here to back up, it's important when one looks at Russian foreign policy, and Chinese foreign policy for that matter, we often think of it as two monolithic structures. And in fact, that there are different factions, there are different tendencies. There are very strong pro-Chinese elements within the Russian establishment. Those elements have been strengthened over the last year, year and a half. And those are the groups that argue that Russia can forge an effective partnership with China in the economy, in defense, in finance, and in essence, it's a repeat of what the Soviet Union did vis-a-vis Japan in the years prior to World War II, because you have some of the same issues of the Russian hold on the Far East is very tenuous. You don't have a lot of Russians living out there. There was always the sense in the 1930s or the 40s that an aggressive, expanding Japan would simply, as they had done during the Russian Civil War, simply seize large chunks of Siberia for themselves. So the Russian strategy, or the Soviet strategy, I should say at the time, was always to turn the Japanese outward, to the Pacific, to Southeast Asia, and essentially to go to the Japanese and say, we'll keep your backyard safe for you. It's very much what the Russians have been doing with the Chinese in recent years, which is to tell the Chinese, yes, there's a lot in Central Asia and Siberia where you could push us out. You could push the Russians out of these areas, but you have bigger fish to fry because you do not have particularly warm and fuzzy relations with the United States. So let Russia secure your backyard for you, and we will provide you with the natural resources, and we can give you secure access to energy that essentially, if these gas deals, for example, this gas deal and these oil deals, if they go through, a key part of the U.S. point of pressure against China, which is that we have our hand on China's jugular through the Straits of Malacca from the Persian Gulf on China's energy supply. A lot of that will disappear because now it will be overland transport of energy. It will give China a much greater degree of confidence. Not that they're going to go to war with the United States, but they'll have a greater degree of confidence that if they do have to face off against the United States, they're not as vulnerable. And so I think you have elements within the Russian foreign policy establishment that are encouraging those kinds of developments and have been able to push back against those elements within the Russian establishment that are worried about China, that say that China is historically a threat to Russia, that in 30 or 40 years a strong China will be able to absorb Russia. These were definitely views that were prominent during the Medvedev administration. It was one of the areas, one of the reasons why the reset worked as much as it did, was that you did have these groups in Russian foreign policy that were very concerned about China. They've largely been sidelined in the Ukraine crisis, and the Sinophiles have risen to a much greater degree of prominence in the Russian foreign policy establishment. And that is leading to this idea, not of alliance, but certainly of a Russian-Chinese entente in Eurasia, which is designed essentially to keep the United States out and to keep the West at bay and to give both Russia and China greater maneuvering room. And that appears to be in the ascendancy right now.
Very interesting. So sticking with Russia and China for a moment, there's been a lot of rumors, reports over the last maybe 18 months that Russia was sort of contemplating a sale of advanced S-400 air defense, as well as the very advanced air, I believe they call it 4++ generation Su-35. Yeah. In your view, will Russia go ahead with such sales? Is that in their interest?
Again, it will depend on how that works its way through the defense industrial complex. On the one hand, certainly sales of those systems to China will be important for revenue, and this is where we come back to sanctions. What will be the bite of sanctions? If we're still having these sanctions in a year, year and a half, if Russia is struggling for cash, there'll be a greater impetus to want to sell those systems. But the Russian defense industry generally is reluctant to want to sell its most advanced equipment to China, simply because the Chinese take it, reverse engineer it, and then start to produce it. And we've already had with jet engines and other Russian-designed military systems where the Chinese essentially have cloned them and are now competing with Russia in international arms markets. So up to this point, I think the Russians will be reluctant to sell the S-400 and the Su-35. But again, a year from now, we need to see where sanctions are and what the bite is in terms of the Russian economy, and that may lead the Russians down the road to reluctantly sell those systems to Beijing.
Well, my final question for you is this. I'm going to pose a scenario to you. Let us suppose that there is some sort of deal in Ukraine. Do you see the tenor of U.S.-Russia relations permanently damaged? We still have the situation in Crimea. That does not look like it is going to be resolved anytime soon. Are we, for the next decade or so, are we sort of locked into, I guess we could say, a Cold War mentality? You know, we see a lot of rhetoric both in Washington and Moscow that is quite frankly dangerous. Do you see, if Ukraine is somehow taken off the table, is there any possibility for working together? I mean, the United States and Russia have many different overlapping points of interest. We think about Iran, we think about Syria, we think about many different issues, trade. Are we sort of stuck for the next 10 years in sort of a damaged sort of cycle of relations?
Certainly the relationship is damaged, and that is not going to be repaired anytime soon. And you raised the question of Crimea, and it's interesting how far this crisis has moved along, that we are now talking about solutions and not going back to the idea of resolving Crimea, because more or less everyone accepts that a solution vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine that de-escalates the current crisis. No one is talking about a return of Crimea to Ukrainian jurisdiction as being part of that. But a number of the US and European sanctions are linked to Crimea, so that even if we were to back away from the current crisis, as long as Crimea remains a part of Russia, there will still be sanctions, there will still be irritants in the relationship. I think that for the most part, the signals we're getting from the White House and the Kremlin is that Presidents Obama and Putin essentially don't want to deal with each other anymore. As long as President Obama stays in office till January of 2017, Putin's earliest departure constitutionally would be if he chooses not to run for another term, he would leave in 2018. That does raise the question of a kind of freezing of the US-Russia relationship. The things that in the past were expected to drive the Russians and the Americans closer together may also be dissipating to the extent that the US has pulled out of Afghanistan, and therefore the northern distribution route disappears and is no longer a point of bringing together. If there's a deal with Iran, if we have more or less reached a final agreement with Iran and that takes Iran off the table. The thing that did bring Russia and America closer together, obviously, in the last decade was the rise of al-Qaeda. And so if there is a resurgence of Islamist terrorism that is targeting both Russia and the United States, you might return to that post-2001 collaboration. But absent that, and absent a Chinese leadership which is very cautious, is not likely to provoke a crisis, I don't see the Chinese doing things that might force Russia and America closer together or to repair that relationship. And so I think that, and this actually builds on another trend, that for both the United States and Russia, that other than the nuclear question, the two countries aren't at the top of each other's agenda anymore. And so you don't have the trade isn't there, the business and investment climate isn't there. There aren't things that push the two countries to have to work together. And so to some extent, again, barring a shift in those things, I could see where we're going to have, not necessarily have Cold War, but we don't really have, we go back actually to what Senator Obama said in 2007 when he was running, where he said that the best outcome, maybe we didn't, not necessarily the best outcome, but the most likely outcome was Russia-U.S. relationship where we're not really friends, but we don't have to be active enemies. And that may be, in fact, where we're moving towards. If we can get Ukraine resolved, we move into this neither friend nor foe position for the foreseeable future.
Excellent. Well, Nick, I would like to thank you. We've been speaking now with Nick Gvosdev, a contributing editor at The National Interest, former editor of The National Interest. My name is Harry Kazianos, managing editor, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.